I never thought the cruelest wound I'd endure would come from the people I trusted most. For years, I lived in the quiet comfort of being a grandfather, content to spoil my granddaughter with stories, sweets, and gentle advice. She teased me sometimes, said I was behind the times, chuckling at my clumsy way of handling a smartphone or fumbling with an app. I laughed with her because it was innocent, affectionate. At least I thought it was. What I didn't realize then was how that small joke would open the door to something far darker. That gentle ribbing gave someone close to me the perfect excuse to write me off, to take advantage of my supposed ignorance. I had built something, wealth, trust, a life's work, and I believed it was safe in the hands of those who smiled at my table. I was wrong. The betrayal, when it surfaced, was like ice water poured down my spine. Lies, hidden papers, secret deals, all crafted behind my back while I was distracted by love and loyalty. They thought I'd never uncover the truth. They thought the old man wouldn't fight back. But they underestimated me. I may have been mocked as outdated, but my mind is sharper than they ever imagined. I will not rage blindly, I will calculate, I will prepare, and I will strike. Justice will come not in fire and fury, but in silence and precision. And when it does, they'll wish they had never mistaken kindness for weakness. Life, before the storm broke, had a rhythm I cherished. Mornings began with the smell of fresh coffee drifting through my kitchen, sunlight spilling across the table where my granddaughter perched with her cereal bowl, legs swinging, eyes alive with curiosity. She was the pulse of my days, the reason I tolerated the aches of age with grace. Watching her grow filled me with a pride that outshone any of the business victories of my younger years. I had been many things in life. A husband, a father, a builder of companies, but being grandpa was my truest joy. My daughter often joked that I had mellowed with age, that the man who once worked tirelessly from dawn to midnight now spent his afternoons teaching a child how to bake bread or reading bedtime stories with animated voices. She was right. In the quiet seasons of life, I discovered a sweetness I'd once been too busy to notice. Around us, the family circle seemed strong. My son-in-law, David, wore the perfect mask of dependability. He had an easy smile, a reassuring handshake, and a knack for saying the right thing at the right time. To neighbors, he was the model of generosity, quick to help carry groceries or offer advice on fixing a leaky faucet. To me, he was the man entrusted with the well-being of my daughter and granddaughter, the one I believed would protect them when I no longer could. We gathered often in the living room, a fire crackling, laughter filling the space. My daughter teased her husband lovingly, my granddaughter danced between us with uncontainable energy, and I sat back, content, the warmth of belonging seeping deep into my bones. Looking back, it's almost painful to remember how perfect those moments felt. The way David would pour my tea with exaggerated courtesy, joking about treating me like the chairman of the board. The way he'd lean in, curious about my old business stories, asking how I negotiated a deal or how I handled failure. At the time, I mistook his interest for respect, maybe even admiration. I didn't realize he was studying me, dissecting me the way a hunter observes prey. But there was one moment, a tiny ripple in the calm, that should have made me pause. One evening, while helping my granddaughter set up a tablet, David chuckled and said, "You know, you should let me handle the tech stuff, sir. These things can get a little tricky for people your age." He smiled as he said it, and my daughter laughed, brushing it off as harmless. I smiled too, because what else was there to do? Still, the words lodged themselves somewhere in the back of my mind. It wasn't the remark itself. After all, I'd heard worse jokes about my fumbling with gadgets. It was the way his eyes lingered, sharp and assessing, as if he were weighing something invisible between us. A look quickly gone, replaced by that practiced grin, but real enough to leave an impression I couldn't quite shake. At the time, I told myself I was imagining things. I wanted to believe the laughter at my table was genuine, that the bonds holding us together were unbreakable. And so I tucked the unease away, buried it beneath the joy of bedtime stories, Sunday dinners, and afternoons in the garden with my granddaughter chasing butterflies. That was the life I knew then, simple, warm, and whole. A life built on trust, love, and the comforting illusion that those closest to me held my best interests at heart. It was an illusion I would cling to a little longer, unaware that the first threads of betrayal were already being woven in the shadows. And though I couldn't see it clearly yet, the laughter in my living room was about to give way to whispers behind closed doors, and the warmth of belonging would soon feel like the cruelest trap of all. It began, as these things often do, with something small: a missing receipt, a check I didn't remember signing. At first, I brushed it aside. Age can make the mind play tricks, and I was the first to admit I wasn't as quick with paperwork as I once had been. But the feeling lingered, a faint itch in the back of my thoughts, a whisper that something wasn't as it should be. I tried to ignore it. My granddaughter's laughter filled the house, my daughter's visits brought warmth, and David's charm remained steady. Yet the more I looked, the more inconsistencies I found. A bank statement tucked under a pile of mail showed a withdrawal I hadn't authorized. An account, supposedly set up for my granddaughter's future, had been accessed more than once without my knowledge. At night, when the house was still, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail. My heart beat heavy with unease, but I forced myself to remain calm. Panic, I knew, was the enemy of clarity. I had spent decades building companies, solving problems that seemed impossible. This would be no different. I would treat it like a puzzle, methodical, deliberate, patient. So I began to watch, quietly, carefully. I observed how David's phone never left his side, how he'd step out onto the porch to take calls in hushed tones. I noticed how he deflected questions with easy humor, how his charm grew almost too polished, too practiced. And I remembered that fleeting look he'd given me when he'd joked about my age and technology, the sharpness in his eyes I dismissed at the time. I started asking questions, gently at first. "Remind me, David," I'd say, feigning absent-mindedness, "did we move that money into the college fund last month, or was it the month before?" He'd smile, reassure me, and glide past the question with practiced ease. "Don't worry, sir, I've got it handled." His answers soothed everyone else. They did not soothe me. One evening, while my granddaughter was asleep upstairs, I unlocked the old filing cabinet where I kept records stretching back years. I spread the papers across my desk, the lamplight casting long shadows as I traced the numbers line by line. There it was again, transfers small at first, then larger, all with David's fingerprints, though cleverly hidden behind joint authorizations and obscure labels. My pulse quickened, but outwardly I remained composed. When my daughter stopped by the study to kiss me goodnight, I smiled and told her I was simply indulging in nostalgia, rereading old business records. She accepted the explanation easily, unaware of the storm brewing behind my calm expression. The next day, I visited the bank under the pretense of updating information. I asked discreet questions, phrased as though I were confused and simply wanted clarity. The banker, respectful but cautious, confirmed what I already suspected. Multiple transactions had been made using my accounts, each signed off electronically. I thanked him politely, my face betraying nothing, even as dread pooled in my stomach. Still, there was no proof of malice yet, no undeniable evidence. Perhaps there was an explanation, I told myself. Perhaps this was all some misunderstanding. Yet the voice inside me, the same voice that had guided me through boardroom negotiations and market crises, whispered otherwise. Something was wrong. Each day, my vigilance grew sharper. I listened more closely to conversations, noted the way David's smile sometimes faltered when money was mentioned. I saw how my daughter trusted him implicitly, how she leaned into his reassurances with absolute faith. And I felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on my shoulders. If there was deception here, I could not allow it to harm her, or especially my granddaughter. And so I gathered, quietly, carefully, piece by piece, photocopies of bank statements, screenshots of accounts, a notebook filled with dates, times, and observations. I became an archivist of suspicion, cataloging each irregularity with the same precision I once applied to financial ledgers. The dread never left me. It pressed against my chest in the quiet hours, threatened to erode my resolve. But alongside the fear was something else, a steady current of determination. I would not leap to accusations, nor would I allow myself to be blinded by anger. I would build my case the way I built everything else in life, brick by brick, fact by fact, until the structure was unassailable. And though I still hoped, deep down, that I was wrong, I could feel the truth circling closer, like a predator testing the edges of the light. The pattern was forming, the shape of betrayal just beginning to emerge. I did not yet know its full scale, but I knew this much: the calm days were behind me. The unraveling had begun and there would be no turning back. The numbers told me a story I didn't want to read. At first, they were just patterns, small discrepancies, strange withdrawals. But when I dug deeper, when I allowed myself to pull every thread, the entire fabric of my world began to unravel in my hands. It was a Tuesday morning, crisp and quiet. My granddaughter had left for school, her laughter still echoing faintly in the hallway. I sat at my desk, the documents spread before me like an autopsy table, each line item another incision into the body of my trust. As my pen traced the figures, my breath grew shallow. The business, my legacy, the company I had built brick by brick, wasn't stable at all. It was drowning. For years, I had believed it was steady, modest perhaps, but secure enough to carry my family into the next generation. My daughter could rely on it, my granddaughter could inherit it, that was the dream. Yet the ledgers told a different truth: debts hidden beneath inflated valuations, loans quietly stacked, assets sold and repurchased like a shell game. What I thought was solid ground was, in fact, quicksand. Shock hit me first, sharp and disorienting, as though the room had tilted sideways. I pushed the papers back, rubbed my temples, tried to will away the figures glaring up at me. Surely I had made a mistake. Surely I had miscalculated. But no, page after page confirmed it. The business wasn't just faltering, it was on the brink of collapse. Grief came next. Not loud or dramatic, but a suffocating weight pressing against my chest. This wasn't just numbers on a page. This was the life I had poured myself into, the foundation on which I had built everything for my family. Every long night, every sacrifice, every risk I had taken, it all suddenly felt like sand slipping through my fingers. I thought of my daughter, who trusted me implicitly, who believed her father's work would provide a safety net for her child. I thought of my granddaughter, so bright, so full of dreams, who might one day ask why the future we promised her never arrived. The image of her face, expectant and trusting, twisted inside me like a knife. The responsibility was immediate, crushing. There was no one else to bear it, no one else to stand between my family and ruin. I could not allow them to see me stagger. My hands trembled as I gathered the papers, smoothed them into neat stacks, locked them back into the cabinet. Outwardly, I forced calm, but inside, grief tangled with determination. That evening, when my daughter visited, I looked at her and realized how much she relied on the illusion of stability I had created. She laughed as she poured tea, her words light, her worries small. I smiled and nodded, hiding the storm raging beneath my skin. She couldn't know, not yet. I needed time. Time to understand the scale of the disaster, time to devise a plan to protect her and her child from its fallout. I stayed awake long after the house was silent. The clock ticked steadily, each second mocking my helplessness. I thought back to the days when the company was young, when I fought tooth and nail to keep it alive. Then I was fueled by ambition, driven by hunger. Now I was fueled by love, driven by the unshakable duty of a grandfather determined to shield his family. In the darkness, I whispered a silent vow: I would not let this business die quietly. I would not let my family be blindsided by ruin. If it meant long nights, painful sacrifices, even humiliation, I would bear it. I had carried heavier burdens before. I could carry this one too. And yet, even as I steeled myself, questions gnawed at me. How had things deteriorated so badly without my noticing? Who had steered the company into such dangerous waters? Was it negligence, incompetence, or something more deliberate? I pushed those thoughts aside for now. The villain was still a shadow, unconnected to this crisis in my mind. My focus had to remain on the problem itself, the immediate threat looming over everything I held dear. Later, perhaps, I would untangle the threads and see what else was woven into this web. For now, there was only the crushing truth. The foundation of my family's future was crumbling, and I was the only one who could hold it together. So I began to plan, quietly, carefully, as I always did. Lists of debts, priorities, possible solutions filled my notebooks. I considered selling assets, restructuring loans, calling in favors from old colleagues. My mind worked relentlessly, refusing rest because failure was not an option, not for me, not for her, not for them. Still, the grief lingered, heavy and suffocating. Each time I looked at my granddaughter's smile, it broke me anew. She was too young to understand, too innocent to see the storm clouds gathering. But I saw them clearly, and I knew the fight of my life was only just beginning. The days after discovering the company's collapse blurred together in a haze of late nights and hollow mornings. I scoured numbers, drafted contingency plans, and reached out discreetly to a few old contacts. My mind worked tirelessly, even when my body begged for rest. Grief weighed heavily, but it was steadied by duty. I told myself again and again that I would find a way through this. And then, like a crack in a dam, truth began to spill. It happened one evening when I returned to the office after everyone had left. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rustle of papers as I searched for contracts I needed to review. I opened the drawer of David's desk, more out of curiosity than suspicion, and found a neatly organized folder labeled innocuously as consulting agreements. Inside, my breath caught. These were no harmless agreements. They were contracts signed in my company's name, authorizing transactions I had never approved. Payments had been siphoned off to shell corporations, money bled away under the guise of services rendered. I studied the signatures. My name was there, forged with a precision that chilled me. And beneath each document was David's countersignature, authentic and undeniable. Shock burned hot, quickly giving way to disbelief. This wasn't negligence, wasn't incompetence. This was betrayal. He hadn't just stumbled into the quicksand that swallowed my company, he had dug the pit himself, all while smiling across my dinner table. I sat back in the chair, the folder heavy in my hands, my pulse pounding in my ears. Memories reeled through my mind, the courteous way he poured my tea, his eager questions about my business, his helpful suggestions when I fumbled with technology. Every gesture that once seemed kind now gleamed with sinister purpose. He had been studying me, learning my weaknesses, preparing to exploit them. The grief that had gripped me days earlier hardened into something sharper, something colder. Anger. Not the wild, blinding fury of youth, but the steady, righteous fire of a man who has been wronged and refuses to be broken. I needed proof beyond my own eyes, so I dug deeper. I combed through digital records, piecing together trails he thought he had erased. I traced money flowing like a poisoned river from our accounts into ventures linked directly to him. Property in his name purchased with company funds. Accounts overseas fattened by money that should have secured my granddaughter's future. The evidence mounted, undeniable and damning. Each discovery was another nail in the coffin of my trust. But what cut deepest was not the theft itself. It was the intimacy of it. He had been family. He had kissed my daughter goodnight, read bedtime stories to my granddaughter, sat by my side in moments of celebration. All the while, he was quietly dismantling the foundation of our lives for his own gain. I remembered that evening on the porch, his eyes glinting when he joked about my age. It wasn't humor, it was arrogance. He believed me obsolete, too blind to catch him, too frail to fight back. That memory, once dismissed, now crystallized as the perfect reflection of his contempt. I closed the files and locked them away, my hands steady despite the storm raging inside me. The evidence was there, undeniable. He had not only known about the crisis, he had orchestrated it. My grief was no longer the sorrow of a man watching his legacy crumble. It had become the fury of a man betrayed, a man with nothing left to lose but everything left to defend. That night I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching the moon cast pale light across the lawn, and I thought about justice. Not the kind that comes from anger's outburst, quick and reckless, but the kind that requires patience, calculation, and precision. The kind that ensures the guilty do not merely stumble, but fall so thoroughly that they can never rise again. When dawn broke, I felt a clarity I hadn't known in weeks. The grief was still there, but it was tempered, forged into steel by anger and purpose. I would not confront him yet. No confrontation without preparation was weakness. I had spent a lifetime mastering the art of strategy, and I would not forget those lessons now. He thought he had outplayed me. He thought the old man was finished. But he had miscalculated one thing: I was still here. And now I knew exactly who my enemy was. The betrayal had been unmasked. The time for mourning was over. The time for justice had begun. The night after I uncovered David's treachery, I sat in my study surrounded by silence. The evidence lay locked away, but I didn't need to see it to feel its weight pressing against me. Betrayal had burned away grief, leaving behind a clarity sharper than glass. Rage threatened to consume me, but I refused to surrender to it. Rage was raw, sloppy, and dangerous. I needed precision. For most of my life, I'd been defined by my ability to solve impossible problems. As an engineer turned businessman, I thrived on logic, structure, and methodical steps. Complex systems never frightened me. They challenged me to think, to break them down piece by piece until the solution revealed itself. David had made the mistake of assuming that because I no longer sat in boardrooms, I'd forgotten the art of strategy. He couldn't have been more wrong. So I began to plan, not with shouts or accusations, but with pen and paper, lists and diagrams. I divided the battle into phases, just as I would any intricate project. Phase 1: information. Knowledge was the foundation of every victory. I needed to map the full extent of David's corruption, his shell companies, hidden accounts, property holdings. Every secret had to be dragged into the light. I created a flowchart of his transactions, arrows crisscrossing like veins in a body. His empire wasn't vast, but it was fragile, propped up on deception. Once exposed, it would collapse under its own weight. Phase 2: isolation. No structure falls cleanly if its supports remain intact. David's greatest strength wasn't money, it was perception. People believed in his charm, his reliability, his devotion as a husband and father. I would strip that away. Quietly, I'd prepare evidence to be delivered not just to authorities, but to the very people who trusted him most: friends, colleagues, even my daughter. When the time came, his mask would shatter. Phase 3: pressure. I had no desire to lash out blindly, that would only warn him. Instead, I'd set subtle traps: assets frozen, debts called in, contracts revoked. Each move would tighten the noose, leaving him scrambling, confused, never realizing who was pulling the rope. By the time he recognized the architect behind his ruin, it would already be too late. Phase 4: exposure. When the walls closed in and he was at his weakest, I would reveal myself, not with anger but with the calm certainty of justice. I would lay out every crime, every deception, every act of betrayal. And I would watch as the arrogance drained from his face, replaced by the panic of a man who realizes the game is already over. The plan, once drafted, gave me peace. It transformed the chaos inside me into order, grief into purpose. Every late-night diagram, every annotated ledger reminded me that I wasn't powerless. David may have stolen from me, but he had underestimated the one resource I had in abundance: patience. Still, planning alone wasn't enough. I needed tools. I reached out discreetly to an old legal colleague, presenting a hypothetical scenario under the guise of curiosity. Their answers confirmed what I suspected: forged signatures, fraudulent transfers, misappropriated funds, all prosecutable. If I timed it correctly, the law itself would become one of my strongest weapons. I also brushed off skills I hadn't used in years. Late into the night, I taught myself how to trace digital transactions, how to follow the breadcrumbs David had tried to scatter. Each discovery felt like tightening a bolt on a machine, securing the structure of my revenge. But revenge for me wasn't about spectacle. It was about balance. He had taken from me what mattered most: trust, security, the foundation of my family's future. My justice would be measured, deliberate, and absolute. In the mornings, my granddaughter still ran to me with her bright smile, and my daughter still laughed over coffee. I wore my mask as well as David wore his, hiding the storm of calculations raging beneath the surface. They saw only the steady grandfather, the calm patriarch. They didn't need to know, not yet, that I was rebuilding our future one quiet step at a time. When I looked at David across the dinner table, his grin wide, his voice smooth, I felt nothing but resolve. He believed he had beaten me, but in truth, the game had only just begun, and I held every piece that mattered. I was no longer simply a man grieving the loss of a company. I was the architect of his downfall. And if you think you've heard stories of betrayal before, wait until you see what happens next. Join me again here because the trap is about to be set and justice, like the streets of Cairo, waits for no one. The first move had to be silent. If David even suspected I was watching, the plan would collapse. So I cloaked myself in the role he expected of me, the harmless old man, fumbling with gadgets and content to let others handle the details. Behind that mask, I began the work of dismantling him. My first step was to freeze the ground beneath his feet. I contacted the bank under the pretense of reviewing my estate planning. With a calm, measured tone, I requested adjustments to authorizations, subtle changes that restored my full control over accounts he thought he could manipulate. A few digital signatures later, the flow of funds stopped. Where he expected money to move freely, he found friction. Where he once siphoned without resistance, he now encountered invisible walls. But walls alone weren't enough. I needed weapons. Every late evening after my family slept, I compiled records, bank statements, forged documents, transaction histories. I arranged them in neat folders, both digital and physical, labeled and cross-referenced with the precision of an engineer mapping a system. Slowly, a picture emerged that was no longer just suspicion or even proof for myself. It was a dossier, a weaponized archive that could destroy him in the eyes of anyone who read it. I shared fragments discreetly with a trusted attorney, presenting them as curiosities, just in case something happened to me. My colleague, seasoned and cautious, didn't ask too many questions, but I saw the glint in their eyes as they confirmed what I already knew. The evidence was overwhelming. Fraud, forgery, embezzlement, crimes that could not be explained away with charm. While David still smiled across the table, I watched the cracks appear. He frowned one evening when his phone buzzed with an alert. He excused himself to the porch, muttering about a minor banking hiccup. I sipped my tea in silence, hiding the satisfaction that spread through me. The trap had only begun to tighten. Next, I turned to allies he didn't even know I had. Old business contacts, men and women who still owed me favors, received careful phone calls. I spoke in riddles, framing my inquiries as legacy checks or academic exercises. But the information they shared was invaluable. David had been leveraging my name to secure investments, to build a reputation as a savvy businessman. Once I cut off access to that credibility, his ventures began to wobble. Investors grew cautious, emails unanswered, meetings postponed. All the while, I remained invisible. My daughter still saw only her dependable husband. My granddaughter still ran into his arms. He had no idea that I was already dismantling the foundation of his world piece by piece. And yet the most satisfying part was watching his arrogance persist even as the ground shifted beneath him. He still strutted into family dinners, still poured my tea with exaggerated grace, still told stories with that smooth grin. He believed himself untouchable. That belief would make his fall all the more devastating. Tension built inside me with each move. Not fear. No, fear had long since hardened into resolve, but anticipation. I had learned long ago that patience was the ally of justice. Every subtle shift I made was another thread pulled from the web he had spun, another piece of his life quietly slipping away. There were moments when the weight of secrecy pressed on me. My daughter's laughter across the table, my granddaughter's innocence, made me ache with the knowledge of what was to come. They saw stability, they saw family. They didn't yet know that beneath the surface, everything was changing. But I carried that burden willingly because when the truth emerged, it would be complete, undeniable, and final. The first phase of my plan was nearly complete. Assets frozen, evidence secured, allies discreetly aligned. David's empire of lies still stood in appearance, but its foundations had already been eroded. Soon, the cracks would widen into chasms, and he would scramble to hold it together, never realizing that I was the architect of his collapse. I played my part perfectly, offering him smiles, asking absent-minded questions about trivial matters, letting him believe I was still the naive old man. And all the while, my mind sharpened the blade that would cut him down. The trap was set, and though he did not yet feel its teeth, They were closing steadily, silently, with every passing day. What he mistook for fortune unraveling by chance was, in truth, justice inching ever closer. I had waited for this moment for weeks, timing it with meticulous care. David thought he was untouchable, confident that the cracks in his empire would go unnoticed, that the chaos I had sown would appear as misfortune, not intention. He was wrong. The confrontation took place in the study, the same room where he had hidden his deceit, where he had smiled at me across the table while quietly dismantling my family's future. I entered with calm precision, closing the door behind me, the quiet click echoing like a verdict. He looked up from his laptop, surprise flickering across his face but quickly replaced by that practiced grin. "Ah," he said smoothly, leaning back in his chair, fingers steepled. "You're here early. Is there a problem with the accounts?" I did not answer immediately. I sat opposite him, letting the silence stretch, letting him grow uncomfortable under its weight. I could see the first crack in his composure, a twitch in his jaw, a slight narrowing of his eyes. Patience, I reminded myself, let him unravel naturally. "I've reviewed everything," I said finally, my voice even, precise. "Every transaction, every account, every contract signed in my name. Do you know what I found?" He chuckled nervously. "If you mean the minor discrepancies we discussed, I assure you." I cut him off, slamming the folder onto the desk. Papers fanned out across the surface, each one a nail in the coffin of his arrogance. "Minor discrepancies," I echoed, voice calm but sharp, each word deliberate. "Let's see, forged signatures, unauthorized transfers, shell corporations receiving company funds, accounts overseas in your name." I could go on, but I think you understand the gravity. His grin faltered. I don't know what you mean," he stammered. "These must be mistakes, miscommunications, you're misreading the records." I leaned forward, placing a finger on a document with his signature. "This is no mistake. This is your hand signing away the security of my granddaughter's future. This is your voice whispering reassurances while emptying accounts. This is your betrayal, documented and undeniable." His face turned pale, he opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. It wasn't like that. I raised a hand. "Save it, I have cross-referenced every transaction. The evidence is in order, the law will back it up. Your charm won't save you, and no story you invent will rewrite what you've done." He leaned back, shaking slightly now, arrogance replaced by panic. "You can't do this, this isn't fair. We can fix this, I can." "You can't fix betrayal," I said. "You can't undo the lies, the theft, the damage you inflicted, and you won't need to, the system is handling it for you. The accounts are frozen, your investors have been informed. Legal counsel is reviewing every contract, you are already trapped." He looked around, desperate, eyes darting as if some unseen hand had closed the doors of opportunity behind him. I didn't mean. "Intent doesn't absolve you," I interrupted. "You didn't stumble into ruin, you engineered it, you profited from it, you believed I wouldn't notice. But I did. I've watched you unravel under your own miscalculations, and now I am here to witness the end of the empire you built on lies." He slammed his laptop shut, frustration boiling into a trembling rage. "This is blackmail, you have no proof that." I held up the folder, tapping it deliberately. "This, all of it is proof. You think panic excuses cleverness. It does. Every forged signature, every fraudulent transfer, every misappropriated fund, each piece has been documented. Each piece will be presented to the authorities, to your investors, to the people who trusted you blindly. Your world has already collapsed." The tears of desperation formed at the corners of his eyes. You can't, don't." "Watch closely," I said. "This is the moment you realize that trust, once broken, cannot be restored. You underestimated me. You underestimated patience, observation, and justice. You believed that kindness was weakness. You were wrong." I began to outline the timeline, the evidence step by step, voice calm, methodical. January, unauthorized withdrawal. March, shell company deposit. May, signature forged on what was meant for my granddaughter. July, mismanaged loans disguised as consulting fees. All traced to you, all verified, all indisputable. With each statement, I saw the transformation in him, from arrogance to disbelief to sheer panic and finally to complete helpless defeat. He tried to argue, tried to deflect, tried to make the blame someone else's, but the structure I had built in silence left no gaps. Every lie he whispered collided with the facts I presented. Every excuse he invented crumbled under the weight of meticulous documentation. By the time I finished, he was slumped in his chair, face pale, mouth open, empty threats dying on his lips. I remained calm, almost serene, the calm eye in the hurricane of his panic. The storm I had engineered from patience, observation, and precision had reached its crescendo. "You see," I said softly, almost pityingly, "this isn't about anger. This isn't about revenge in the moment. This is justice. You were given every chance to act honorably. You chose deceit, you chose theft, and now you face the consequences." He buried his face in his hands. The arrogance was gone, the charm extinguished. Only a hollow panic remained. He no longer looked at me as a man to be feared, but as an inevitability, someone who had anticipated every step, who had already won. I stood, gathered the folder, and walked to the door. "I've done my part. The rest is in the hands of the law, of those you defrauded. You will answer for what you've done, but remember this: the collapse was not sudden. It was measured, precise, deliberate. Every step you took to harm my family has been mirrored by my steps to protect it. That is the balance you will live with from this day forward." He whispered my name, trembling, pleading, but I did not look back. The room, once filled with his smug confidence, now echoed with the sound of inevitability. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the walls, the shadows of a man's empire crumbling, the shadows of justice realized. As I walked down the hallway, the weight in my chest lifted slightly. The confrontation was over, the truth revealed, and the villain exposed. The house was still, the air quiet, and I allowed myself a breath, a measured inhale of satisfaction tempered by the responsibility that remained. I had done what was necessary. I had orchestrated the collapse, but it was justice, not vengeance, that had guided me. And somewhere in the quiet of the city that had once felt so small, I felt the first whisper of peace. The days after the confrontation were a strange blend of quiet and chaos. David had disappeared from our lives as quickly as his empire had collapsed. The authorities moved faster than I anticipated, his assets frozen, accounts seized, and within a week, formal charges were filed. His apartment was cleared, belongings packed by movers under official supervision. The neighbors, once impressed by his charm, whispered in disbelief as eviction notices were posted in the lobby. I watched it unfold from a distance, careful to remain removed from the spectacle. There was no joy in witnessing someone else's downfall, only the satisfaction of inevitability. Justice had been served not by my hands alone, but by the system I had aligned with my own strategy. Every document I had gathered, every calculated move I had made, had ensured the collapse was swift and unassailable. He could no longer manipulate, charm, or deceive. The man who once ruled our family with hidden malice was powerless, exposed, and accountable. The legal process moved methodically. Attorneys reviewed the evidence I had compiled, witnesses were called, and his attempts at defense crumbled under the weight of facts. His arrogance, which had carried him for so long, offered no protection now. When the court entered judgment, it was precise, indisputable, and final. He would face years of penalties, restitution, and a tarnished reputation from which he could never recover. For my family, the aftermath was lighter, though not without its own adjustments. My daughter, initially overwhelmed by the revelations, began to reclaim a sense of security. The weight of uncertainty lifted slowly, replaced with a cautious optimism. My granddaughter, unaware of much of the turmoil, returned to her routines with laughter and curiosity, her presence a balm for the lingering tension that had filled our home. I spent mornings revisiting accounts and restructuring what remained of the business, not out of obsession, but to restore stability. Each corrected ledger, each reconciled balance was a step toward rebuilding trust and safety. My focus was no longer just survival, it was restoration. The household began to breathe again. Family dinners resumed without the shadow of deceit hanging over the table. Conversations, once careful and guarded, became natural. Laughter returned, softer at first, then stronger, more certain. Even the garden felt renewed, as if the act of tending flowers could mend more than soil. Though the threat had been removed, I remained vigilant, not out of suspicion, but as a reminder of lessons learned. Trust, once betrayed, demands both caution and discernment, yet I refuse to let past treachery define the future. The hero of this story, though scarred, was not broken. I also reached out to others affected by David's schemes. Friends and colleagues who had been manipulated or misled found closure in the legal outcomes. Each call, each meeting reminded me that justice extended beyond our household. It was not personal vindictiveness that guided me, but a sense of moral duty to protect not only my family, but the integrity of those who had unknowingly been entangled in his deception. Even in quiet moments when the house was still and my granddaughter slept, I allowed myself reflection. The grief that had once gnawed at me now felt like a tempered memory, a warning that sharpened my perspective. I could feel peace settling in, not as an absence of pain, but as the knowledge that I had acted decisively, morally, and with measured resolve. The first nights of sleep without fear were brief but restorative. My mind, once racing with calculations and contingencies, could finally rest. The household felt secure, the foundations of our lives stabilized, and a sense of normalcy returned. Even the small, mundane moments, watching my granddaughter chase a butterfly in the garden, sharing tea with my daughter at breakfast, were infused with renewed significance. And as the days passed, I realized the truth I had fought to protect. Justice, when executed with care, patience, and integrity, not only punishes the guilty but restores balance, dignity, and hope to those wronged. The shadow of betrayal had lifted. David's downfall was complete. My family's future, once teetering on the edge of ruin, was now anchored firmly in security. And for the first time in months, I allowed myself to believe in tomorrow, not as a threat but as a promise. The storm had passed. We could begin to heal. 1 year later, the house felt alive in a way it hadn't for a long time. Mornings were filled with the soft hum of sunlight through the windows, the smell of fresh coffee mingling with the faint aroma of my granddaughter's cereal. Her laughter bounced through the halls as she chased our cat across the living room, and for the first time in years I could simply watch, unburdened by dread or suspicion. The business, once teetering on the edge of ruin, had been restored under careful management. I no longer needed to shoulder every detail myself. The lessons of the past had taught me to delegate wisely and trust cautiously. Still, I kept a vigilant eye, not out of fear, but as a safeguard against repetition. Each reconciled ledger and secured account was a quiet reminder that vigilance paired with patience is a force far stronger than brute strength or deceit. My daughter had flourished too. She returned to her career with renewed confidence, buoyed by the knowledge that her family's foundation was secure. She no longer flinched at the thought of financial instability or the treachery that had once threatened us. And my granddaughter, bright, resilient, and full of curiosity, had grown into a child whose laughter was no longer tempered by shadowed fears. Every bedtime story, every shared secret felt like a small victory in the rebuilding of our lives. As for David, the law had carried out its verdict with precision. His empire of deceit had crumbled completely. He faced prison, restitution payments, and a reputation so tarnished that even former allies turned their backs. News reports occasionally trickled in, recounting his failed appeals and the pitiful state of the life he had tried to construct on lies. The man who had once smiled at me across our family table now existed only as a cautionary tale of arrogance undone by justice. Even with his downfall, I found that revenge had never been the point. The true triumph was the restoration of trust, of peace, and of the small but essential joys of daily life. The house, once shadowed by fear and deception, was now filled with laughter, with ordinary routines made extraordinary by their simplicity. We celebrated birthdays without hesitation, cooked meals without tension, and allowed our hearts to heal in the warmth of honesty and security. I spent afternoons in the garden with my granddaughter, teaching her to plant flowers and tend vegetables. She asked questions with endless curiosity, and I answered patiently, knowing that these small lessons carried weight far beyond the soil beneath our fingers. My daughter often joined us, sharing stories of work, friends, and the quiet triumphs that made life worth living. These moments, simple yet profound, were evidence that resilience can flourish even after the darkest betrayals. Sometimes I pause to reflect on the past, the treachery, the crisis, the long nights spent unraveling deceit. It no longer filled me with anger, only with a sense of gratitude for the lessons learned and the strength discovered in the process. I had faced betrayal, orchestrated justice, and emerged intact, not only as a protector of my family, but as a man reminded of the value of patience, intellect, and moral clarity. Looking ahead, I could see a future not defined by fear, but by the possibilities of what we could build together. The shadow of David's deceit remained a memory, a caution, but it no longer had power over our lives. Love, trust, and perseverance had restored what had been threatened, and in some ways made it stronger than before. And so, in the quiet warmth of our home, I watched my granddaughter chase sunlight across the garden, my daughter's laughter echoing softly nearby, and I felt a profound contentment. The storm had passed, justice had been served, and in the aftermath, our life was reclaimed, whole and beautiful once more. So we were no longer merely surviving, we were thriving.